The air in the valleys of southern Transylvania carried the scent of decay, long before the Hungarian army arrived, a peculiar mixture of rotting wood and the mineral tang that rose from ancient rock when autumn rains penetrated deep into the earth's cold bones. The year was 1330, and the Kingdom of Hungary stood at a crossroads that few among the living understood, though the dead would soon have much to say about the path chosen. King Charles Robert of Anjou, known to his subjects as Caroly Robert, and to history as Carol Robert, sat upon a throne whose foundations rested not on Hungarian soil, but on the political machinations of a distant pope and the ambitions of a French dynasty that had inserted itself into the heart of Central Europe like a gleaming blade wrapped in purple silk. His claim to rule derived from his grandmother, Maria of Hungary, but legitimacy written on parchment and legitimacy earned through blood are currencies that exchange at vastly different rates in the economy of medieval power, and Charles Robert had spent the first 2 decades of his reign learning this harsh arithmetic through a succession of rebellions, assassinations and compromises that left him perpetually aware of how fragile his crown truly was. The Hungarian nobility regarded him with suspicion barely concealed beneath courtly manners, remembering that his father had been Charles Martel of Anjou, Sicily, a man who had never even set foot on Hungarian soil before his death, and that the young king had arrived from Naples speaking no Hungarian, understanding nothing of the traditions that bound the Magyar lords to their lands and their fierce independence. By 1330, Charles Robert had clawed his way to genuine authority through a combination of strategic marriages, carefully distributed favours, and a willingness to use violence when persuasion failed, but his kingdom remained a patchwork of competing interests, and the southern frontier represented both an opportunity and a threat that demanded his personal attention. Beyond the Carpathian Mountains, in the lands that would eventually become the Principality of Wallachia, a political transformation had been unfolding that threatened to remake the entire balance of power in the region, though its significance remained invisible to those who measured importance solely by the size of armies and the grandeur of fortifications. A man named Basarab, whose very origins remain shrouded in the kind of uncertainty that plagues historians, but which contemporaries accepted as the natural obscurity surrounding those who rise from positions too low to merit recording, had consolidated power over the Romanian-speaking peoples dwelling in the plains and foothills south of Transylvania, creating something unprecedented and dangerous, an autonomous principality that acknowledged no superior authority and recognized no obligation to the Hungarian crown that had long considered these territories to be within its sphere of influence, if not outright possession. The Hungarian kings had traditionally exercised a vague overlordship over these lands, extracting tribute when they could, appointing voivodes when the local power structure permitted, and generally treating the region as a buffer zone whose primary purpose was to absorb the first shock of any nomadic invasion rolling westward from the steppes, or Ottoman pressure pushing northward from the Balkans. Basarab had transformed this arrangement without asking permission, and worse still from the Hungarian perspective, he had done so gradually enough that no single moment existed when rebellion could be clearly identified and punished before it became too late. His forces had not stormed any Hungarian castles, his emissaries had not delivered dramatic declarations of independence, and his coins did not yet bear the marks of sovereignty. Yet everyone who understood the subtle language of medieval politics recognized that a vassal who ceases to appear when summoned, who fortifies his own strongholds while allowing his overlord's garrisons to wither, and who begins dispensing justice in his own name without reference to higher authority, has already declared independence in every way that matters, and only awaits the moment when force will compel him to make explicit what has long been implicit. Charles Robert had watched this process with mounting frustration, constrained by the reality that his kingdom faced threats from multiple directions, and that his treasury, despite recent improvements, could not support simultaneous campaigns on every frontier where his authority faced challenge. The Austrians pressed from the west with territorial claims and dynastic ambitions. The Serbs and other Balkan powers shifted unpredictably in the south, and the constant low-grade conflict with various Lithuanian and Ruthenian principalities in the northeast drained resources while producing no decisive results, creating a strategic environment where allowing one challenge to pass unanswered might invite others to test the limits of royal power. The king's advisors divided on the question of Basarab, with some arguing that a semi-independent but relatively stable Wallachia served Hungarian interests better than the alternatives, which ranged from direct administration requiring permanent garrisons in hostile territory to complete abandonment, creating a power vacuum that more dangerous forces might fill, while others insisted that permitting a vassal to establish independence would send ripples of rebellion throughout the kingdom, encouraging every ambitious magnate to test whether he too might escape the constraints of royal authority. The debate had continued for several years, conducted in the palaces of Buda and Visegrad through formal councils and informal conversations, through letters carried by messengers who understood that the difference between peace and war often depended on which particular Latin phrases they emphasized when delivering their texts. But by 1330 the decision had been made, or perhaps more accurately, the weight of accumulated insults and strategic concerns had grown heavy enough to tip the scales toward action, despite the risks that more cautious voices continued to enumerate. The Hungarian army that assembled for the campaign against Basarab represented a formidable concentration of military power by the standards of the era, though its true strength lay not in sheer numbers, but in the quality and diversity of its components, each of which brought particular capabilities to the enterprise while also introducing fault lines that would prove catastrophic when pressure was applied in unexpected ways. The core of the force consisted of the heavily armoured cavalry that dominated European warfare in this period, mounted warriors whose equipment represented an investment equivalent to modern military aircraft, each knight supported by a complex network of estates, peasant labourers, craftsmen who maintained arms and armour, and attendants who handled the countless details required to keep a man in fighting condition while burdened with 60 pounds of steel. These knights rode horses bred specifically for war, animals large enough to carry an armoured rider at speed sufficient to generate devastating impact, trained from early age to tolerate the chaos of battle and the screams of dying men, valued at prices that could feed a peasant family for years and protected by their own armour that transformed them into mobile fortresses. The Hungarian magnates who led these contingents brought not only their military expertise, but also their political agendas, their rivalries with other noble families, their calculations about how success or failure in this campaign might affect their standing at court, and their deeply ingrained assumptions about how warfare should be conducted, assumptions rooted in centuries of European military tradition that emphasized direct confrontation between mounted warriors as the proper and honourable method of resolving disputes between Christian princes. Supporting these elite cavalry units came contingents of lighter-armed horsemen, many of whom descended from the Cumans and other steppe peoples who had settled within Hungarian territory in previous centuries, bringing tactical traditions quite different from those of the armoured knights, favouring mobility over protection, harassment over direct assault, and fluid battlefield formations over the rigid discipline of Western cavalry charges. The infantry component included German-speaking townsmen from the Transylvanian Saxon communities, professional soldiers whose presence reflected the urbanisation that had begun transforming parts of the kingdom, and whose combat methods involved close-order formations with spears and crossbows, rather than the individual heroics favoured by the mounted nobility, creating an army that on paper combined multiple tactical systems, but in practice contained unresolved tensions about leadership, strategy, and the fundamental question of what they were attempting to achieve. Charles Robert had proclaimed that the campaign would teach Basarab proper submission, that the voivode would be compelled to renew his oaths of vassalage under conditions that removed any ambiguity about his subordinate status, and that Hungarian authority would be restored throughout the region in a manner visible enough to discourage future challenges. But behind these public declarations lay a more complex reality that would complicate every decision made during the months that followed. The king needed a victory that was genuine enough to satisfy his critics among the nobility, but not so complete that it would require permanent occupation of Wallachia, which would drain resources from other frontiers and commit Hungarian power to defending territory of marginal economic value against enemies who could choose the time and place of their attacks. Basarab, for his part, understood that outright victory against the assembled might of Hungary remained beyond his capabilities, but that survival with his autonomy intact would constitute success, provided he could avoid the catastrophic defeat that would allow Charles Robert to install a puppet voivode and garrison key fortresses with Hungarian troops. This asymmetry of objectives meant that the two sides entered the conflict pursuing goals that did not mirror each other, creating opportunities for misunderstanding and miscalculation that would multiply as the campaign progressed and both sides discovered that events on the ground refused to conform to the neat scenarios imagined in palaces and strongholds. The Hungarian army crossed into Wallachia in the late summer of 1330, moving through the Carpathian passes with the slow deliberation that characterized medieval military campaigns. Their progress measured not in hours but in days, as thousands of men and horses navigated mountain paths never designed to accommodate such traffic. The logistics of moving a medieval army dwarfed the actual fighting in complexity and difficulty, requiring advanced planning that accounted for the availability of fodder for horses at specific locations, the capacity of local mills to grind sufficient grain to feed the soldiers, the location of water sources reliable enough to supply the needs of men and animals who could die of dehydration faster than enemy action could kill them, and the ever-present problem of maintaining discipline among troops whose enthusiasm for campaigning diminished rapidly once they left friendly territory and began experiencing the discomforts of sleeping in armour, eating spoiled food, and marching through rain that turned every path into a river of mud. The Hungarian commanders had planned their route based on intelligence gathered during previous, smaller expeditions and from merchants who travelled the region, but this information proved incomplete and sometimes deliberately misleading, as Basarab had spent years ensuring that Hungarian knowledge of his territories remained superficial and often inaccurate, bribing informants, spreading false reports, and controlling access to ensure that visitors saw only what he wished them to see. The initial stages of the campaign proceeded according to the Hungarian expectations, with the army advancing into Wallabian territory, occupying several fortified positions that Basarab's forces abandoned without significant resistance, and receiving the submission of local boyars who recognized that opposing the assembled might of Hungary would result in the immediate destruction of their estates and likely their deaths. Charles Robert interpreted these early successes as confirmation that his strategy was working, that Basarab understood the futility of resistance and would soon appear to negotiate terms that would restore the proper relationship between vassal and overlord. But the voivode had no intention of submitting, and was instead implementing a plan whose sophistication would only become apparent when it reached its bloody conclusion. Rather than concentrating his forces for a conventional battle that would play to Hungarian strengths, Basarab dispersed his troops throughout the countryside, ordering them to shadow the Hungarian advance while avoiding direct engagement, to drive off livestock and hide grain reserves so that the invaders would find no supplies to requisition, to destroy bridges and foul wells, and to maintain constant pressure through small-scale raids that killed isolated foragers and cut down stragglers without ever offering the kind of target that would allow the Hungarian cavalry to utilize its devastating charge. This strategy of evasion required extraordinary discipline from Basarab's forces, who had to watch enemy troops occupying their lands, burning their villages and terrorizing the population without responding in ways that would bring on the general engagement that Hungary sought, and it tested the voivode's authority as subordinate commanders questioned whether this approach would ultimately succeed, or whether they were simply postponing an inevitable defeat while allowing their homeland to be ravaged. Basarab maintained control through a combination of personal charisma, strategic vision that his officers gradually came to appreciate, and the unspoken understanding that alternative approaches led only to destruction, as demonstrated by the fate of other regional powers that had attempted conventional resistance against major kingdoms. The Hungarian army penetrated deep into Wallachia, reaching the Danube and even crossing it at certain points, projecting power throughout the region in a display that should have brought Basarab to the negotiating table with a willingness to accept whatever terms the king offered. Yet the voivode remained elusive, his forces visible but untouchable, his communications with the Hungarians consisting of ambiguous messages that suggested negotiations might be possible, while never quite committing to specific times or places. Summer transitioned into autumn, and the character of the campaign began to shift in ways that troubled the more experienced Hungarian commanders, even as the king continued to speak optimistically about imminent success. The army had achieved its tactical objectives, occupying territory and demonstrating that Hungarian military power could reach any part of Wallachia, but these accomplishments produced no strategic resolution because Basarab refused to acknowledge defeat, and an enemy who will not submit cannot be made to do so unless one is willing to commit to permanent occupation, which the Hungarians were not prepared to undertake. The question of when to withdraw began to dominate discussions among the Hungarian leadership, with some arguing that they should depart immediately while the weather still permitted safe passage through the mountain passes, while others insisted that leaving without a formal submission from Basarab would transform what looked like a successful campaign into a pointless expenditure of resources that had achieved nothing permanent. Charles Robert found himself trapped by his own earlier pronouncements, having declared that he would restore proper order to the region and compel Basarab to recognise Hungarian overlordship, goals that remained unachieved despite weeks of military operations that had cost his treasury enormous sums and his soldiers considerable suffering. The decision to continue the campaign into October represented a compromise between these competing pressures, an attempt to maintain presence long enough that perhaps Basarab would finally accept that resistance was futile, while not extending operations so late that winter weather would make withdrawal impossible. But this middle course satisfied neither objective and instead created the conditions for catastrophe. The Hungarian army began its retreat in mid-October, moving back toward Transylvania with an awareness that they were now vulnerable in ways they had not been during the advance, when momentum and the element of choice about when and where to move had provided some protection against enemy action. An army in retreat reveals its fear even when commanders insist they are merely conducting a strategic redeployment, and the troops who had marched confidently into Wallachia now moved with the nervous energy of men who understood that they were in hostile territory where every hill might conceal an ambush and every narrow valley represented a potential trap. The route selected for the withdrawal took the army toward the Posada Valley, a region that would become synonymous with one of medieval Europe's most complete military disasters, though the Hungarian scouts who examined the terrain in advance reported nothing more concerning than difficult ground that would require careful navigation, failing to recognise that they were observing a landscape that Basarab had selected specifically for its tactical properties. A natural killing ground whose features would neutralise every Hungarian advantage, while magnifying the effectiveness of defenders who understood how to use terrain as a weapon. Basarab had waited for this moment throughout the entire campaign, enduring criticism from his own supporters who questioned his refusal to engage the Hungarians directly, preserving his forces while watching villages burn and subjects suffer, maintaining discipline among troops who wanted to fight, and nobles who feared that passivity would be interpreted as weakness. The voivoda understood what many of his contemporaries did not, that victory in medieval warfare did not necessarily require destroying the enemy's army in open battle, that strategic success could be achieved by making the costs of occupation unsustainable, by demonstrating that apparent military superiority could not be translated into political control, and that patience exercised at the right moments could create opportunities that aggression would foreclose. His scouts had tracked the Hungarian army's movements throughout its time in Wallachia, noting the decline in morale as weeks passed without decisive results, observing the deteriorating condition of horses that had found insufficient fodder, recording the depletion of supplies that forced Hungarian foragers to venture further from the main body in search of food, and identifying the growing disagreements among the Hungarian leadership about whether to continue operations or withdraw. When Charles Robert finally ordered the retreat, Basarab recognised that the decisive moment had arrived. That an army withdrawing through mountain passes would be strung out over considerable distances, that the psychological advantage would shift from the invaders to the defenders, and that terrain could be selected that would prevent the Hungarian cavalry from deploying in the massed formations that gave them their overwhelming power. The Posada Valley in late October of 1330 presented a landscape shaped by both geology and the season, a narrow corridor where mountains pressed close on either side, where autumn rains had swollen streams into torrents that restricted the available routes, and where vegetation still provided sufficient cover for troops to remain hidden until they revealed themselves by attacking. The floor of the valley offered only limited space for large formations to manoeuvre, divided by watercourses and broken ground that would force an army to stretch into columns, rather than maintaining the compact masses that provided mutual support, and the surrounding heights provided perfect positions for forces that controlled them to rain missiles down on anyone trapped below. Military theorists of the era understood these principles in abstract terms, but the Hungarian commanders approaching Posada apparently failed to recognise how completely the terrain favoured defenders, or perhaps they believed that Basarab lacked the skill or the forces to exploit these advantages, or possibly they simply saw no alternative route that would not expose them to equal or greater risks. The decision to proceed through the valley rather than seeking another path, or waiting for conditions to improve, or sending advance forces to secure the heights before committing the main army, represented a failure of reconnaissance and imagination that would cost thousands of lives, but from the perspective of the Hungarian leadership at that moment, they were simply taking the most direct route back to Transylvania, expecting perhaps some harassment from Basarab's forces, but not anticipating anything approaching the catastrophe that awaited them. Basarab positioned his forces with a sophistication that suggests he had studied the terrain carefully and thought deeply about how to maximize the advantages it offered, while compensating for his army's weaknesses in equipment and training compared to the Hungarian knights. The heights on both sides of the valley received contingents of archers and light infantry, whose role was not to defeat the Hungarian cavalry in direct combat, which would have been impossible, but to harass them, to create chaos, to force them into defensive postures that prevented them from organising the coordinated charges that represented their primary tactical method. The narrowest section of the valley, where the Hungarian column would be most compressed and least able to manoeuvre, was selected for the main ambush, with forces concealed in positions that allowed them to attack from multiple directions simultaneously, creating confusion about where the primary threat lay and preventing the Hungarians from concentrating their response. Additional troops were positioned to block any attempt at retreat back down the valley, ensuring that once the trap was sprung, the Hungarians would have only two options: fight through the ambush toward Transylvania or die in the attempt. The Wallachian forces included not only Basarab's professional soldiers, but also significant numbers of peasants and townsmen, mobilized for what their leaders presented as a defensive struggle against foreign invasion, armed with whatever weapons they possessed or could improvise, their lack of training and equipment offset by intimate knowledge of the local terrain, desperation born of fighting on their own land, and the psychological advantage of attacking an enemy who expected them to flee. The Hungarian army entered the Posada Valley on November 9, 1330, though some chronicles suggest the action may have begun a day earlier, the uncertainty reflecting both the chaos of the battle itself and the fact that few participants survived with clear memories of the sequence of events, their recollections fragmented by trauma and the fog of combat that reduces even trained warriors to a state where they can describe what happened immediately around them but have no understanding of the larger battle. The vanguard of the Hungarian column had already penetrated deep into the valley when Basarab's forces revealed themselves, emerging from concealment on the heights and blocking the route ahead, transforming what had appeared to be a routine march through difficult terrain into a nightmarish struggle for survival. The initial Hungarian response followed their training and instincts, with the mounted knights attempting to form up for charges against the enemy positions. But the terrain that Basarab had selected specifically prevented such manoeuvres, forcing the cavalry to advance in small groups rather than in the massed formations that created their terrible momentum, reducing them to individual combats where numbers and position mattered more than the quality of armour and weapons. The arrows and javelins raining down from the heights found targets among both men and horses, creating cascading failures as wounded animals panicked and threw their riders or crashed into other horses, blocking the narrow paths and creating obstacles that prevented reinforcements from reaching the vanguard. Charles Robert remained with the main body of the army, attempting to understand what was happening ahead and to organise a response that would break through the ambush, but the length of the column and the nature of the terrain meant that information travelled slowly and arrived in confused, often contradictory forms, with messengers reporting that the vanguard was under attack but disagreeing about the size and composition of the Wallachian forces, the location of the main threat, and whether the situation could be restored through reinforcement, or whether retreat represented the only viable option. The king's commanders divided on the appropriate response, with some arguing for an immediate all-out assault to smash through the ambush before Basarab's forces could consolidate their advantage, while others insisted that committing more troops into the valley would simply feed them piecemeal into a killing zone, and that preservation of the army required withdrawing and seeking an alternative route. These debates consumed precious time during which the situation ahead deteriorated as the Hungarian vanguard found itself increasingly surrounded, running low on arrows for those who carried bows, suffering mounting casualties, and losing the cohesion that allowed organised resistance as individual units became isolated from each other by the terrain and enemy pressure. The fighting that developed in the Posada Valley bore little resemblance to the idealised combat celebrated in the chivalric literature of the era, where individual prowess determined outcomes and honour constrained the methods warriors employed. Instead, the battle devolved into a chaotic, brutal struggle, where the Wallachian forces used every advantage terrain and numbers provided, targeting horses to bring down knights, who became vulnerable once dismounted, surrounding isolated groups and overwhelming them through sheer weight of numbers and showing no mercy to enemies who expected quarter based on the conventions that supposedly governed warfare between Christian nobles. The Hungarian knights discovered that their elaborate armour, which could turn aside sword blows and deflect arrows at longer ranges, became a burden when they were pulled from their horses and forced to fight on foot in muddy, broken ground, where mobility mattered more than protection. The Wallachian peasants and light infantry, whom the knights had dismissed as militarily insignificant, proved terrifyingly effective when fighting on their own terms, using long spears to keep armoured opponents at distance, employing axes and clubs to batter at joints and weak points in armour, and working in groups to drag down individual knights who found themselves isolated from their companions. The systematic slaughter of the Hungarian vanguard unfolded over hours that must have felt like days to those experiencing it, as units that had entered the valley confident of their military superiority were methodically destroyed, their banners captured, their commanders killed or taken prisoner, and their survivors scattered into the forests and ravines, where many would die of exposure or be hunted down in the days that followed. King Charles Robert, receiving increasingly desperate reports from the vanguard and recognizing that the situation had deteriorated beyond recovery, faced a choice that would haunt him for the remainder of his reign: commit the main body of the army to a rescue attempt that would likely result in complete destruction of his forces, or abandon the vanguard to its fate and attempt to save what could be saved by immediate withdrawal. The decision to retreat represented not cowardice, but a cold calculation that losing one part of the army was preferable to losing everything, yet it meant condemning thousands of men to death or capture, and it ensured that the Battle of Posada would be remembered as a catastrophic defeat, rather than a difficult engagement where the Hungarians had been forced to withdraw. The main body of the Hungarian army began its retreat in conditions approaching panic, with discipline fraying as individual soldiers and even entire units decided that survival required abandoning the slow-moving column and striking out on their own, in the hope that smaller groups might evade the Wallachian forces that were now emerging throughout the region. Basarab's troops pursued with an energy born of years of frustration, and the sudden, intoxicating realization that they had not merely survived Hungarian invasion, but had inflicted a crushing defeat on one of Europe's major military powers, transforming themselves from desperate defenders into hunters stalking prey through forests and mountains they knew intimately, while the Hungarians stumbled through unfamiliar territory in deteriorating weather. The pursuit continued for days after the initial battle, with Wallachian forces tracking down isolated groups of Hungarian soldiers, ambushing supply wagons that had become separated from the main column, and attacking from the forests at moments calculated to spread maximum terror and prevent the Hungarians from consolidating their forces or establishing defensive positions. The chronicles speak of 4 days of continuous fighting, though this should be understood not as a single sustained battle but as a running series of engagements, ambushes and massacres distributed across a wide area as the Hungarian retreat disintegrated into a desperate flight toward the relative safety of Transylvania. The death toll mounted with each passing day, knights who had survived the initial ambush falling to follow-up attacks or dying from wounds that became infected in conditions where proper medical care was impossible, horses collapsing from exhaustion or injuries and leaving their riders vulnerable to pursuers, and supplies running out so that even those who evaded immediate death faced the prospect of starving in the mountains. The psychological impact of the disaster spread through the Hungarian ranks faster than any physical attack could have, destroying the morale and unit cohesion that held medieval armies together, transforming an organised military force into a mob of frightened individuals whose only thought was personal survival, regardless of what happened to their comrades or their king. Charles Robert reached Transylvania having lost the majority of the army he had led into Wallachia, the precise numbers remaining uncertain because record-keeping during the retreat had collapsed, and because many soldiers who escaped immediate death were captured or died of exposure in the weeks following the battle, making an accurate accounting impossible. Contemporary estimates of Hungarian casualties varied wildly, with some chronicles suggesting 5,000 dead and others claiming figures as high as 10 or even 20,000. The uncertainty reflecting both the lack of reliable records and the tendency of medieval sources to inflate numbers for dramatic effect, but even conservative modern estimates place the death toll in the thousands, representing a significant portion of Hungary's military elite and a catastrophic loss of trained soldiers, expensive equipment, and political capital. The cream of Hungarian nobility had been killed in the Posada Valley or during the subsequent pursuit, their deaths creating succession crises in dozens of families, disrupting the kingdom's military structure and removing experienced commanders whose knowledge could not be easily replaced. The loss of horses represented an economic disaster, almost as significant as the human casualties, each warhorse representing years of breeding and training and considerable financial investment, and the death or capture of thousands of these animals in a few days would affect Hungarian military capabilities for years to come. Basarab emerged from the campaign having achieved a victory whose significance transcended the immediate military results, demonstrating that determined resistance using terrain and tactics appropriate to local conditions could defeat even the most formidable conventional forces, establishing Wallachia's de facto independence in a manner far more effective than any treaty or diplomatic recognition could have done, and creating a founding myth for Romanian state building that would resonate through subsequent centuries. The voivode had proven himself a commander of genuine strategic vision, patient enough to endure months of apparent passivity while waiting for the right moment to strike, sophisticated enough to recognize how terrain could neutralize enemy advantages, and bold enough to commit fully to a plan that risked everything on a single engagement. The Battle of Posada entered the historical record as one of medieval Europe's most dramatic reversals, a confrontation where the supposedly weaker force had not merely survived, but had inflicted catastrophic defeat on a major kingdom, using methods that challenged contemporary assumptions about how warfare should be conducted and who had the right to claim sovereignty over disputed territories. The victory did not immediately resolve all questions about Wallachia's status, and Hungarian kings would continue to claim theoretical overlordship for decades. But the practical reality was that Basarab had established a precedent and demonstrated capabilities that made future attempts at subjugation far less likely to succeed, creating space for the development of Romanian political institutions that would eventually coalesce into the principalities that dominated the region for centuries. The strategic consequences of Posada rippled outward from the Carpathian region to affect the broader balance of power in Central and Eastern Europe, though these effects took years to fully manifest and were often indirect rather than obvious. Charles Robert's defeat weakened Hungarian prestige at a moment when the kingdom faced challenges on multiple frontiers, emboldening rivals who had previously hesitated to confront Hungarian power directly, and encouraging internal opponents who saw the disaster as evidence of the king's poor judgment or perhaps divine disfavour. The enormous financial cost of the failed campaign strained the royal treasury, requiring new taxes and extraordinary levies that created friction with the nobility and limited the resources available for other projects, forcing postponement of plans that might have strengthened the kingdom in other areas. The loss of so many experienced soldiers and commanders created gaps in Hungary's military structure that took years to fill, during which time the kingdom was more vulnerable to external attack and less capable of projecting power beyond its borders. These immediate consequences combined with longer-term effects that historians continue to debate, including the question of whether Posada represented a turning point after which Hungarian expansion southward became unsustainable, or whether it was simply one setback in a longer competition for dominance in the region that would continue under different forms for generations. The tactical and operational lessons that might have been drawn from Posada seem to have been largely ignored by contemporary military thinkers, who found it easier to attribute the disaster to bad luck, poor intelligence, or specific errors by individual commanders, rather than acknowledging that the battle revealed fundamental vulnerabilities in the military system that dominated European warfare. The heavily armoured cavalry that had proven so effective in open-field battles against similarly equipped opponents showed critical weaknesses when operating in terrain that prevented them from deploying in proper formations, when facing enemies who refused to engage on terms favourable to mounted warriors, and when pursuing strategic objectives that required occupying and controlling territory rather than simply defeating enemy armies. The Wallachian forces had demonstrated that mobility, knowledge of terrain, willingness to avoid decisive battles until conditions favoured defenders, and integration of different troop types in ways that maximised their respective strengths could overcome significant disadvantages in equipment and training. But European military establishments continued to invest primarily in heavy cavalry for decades after Posada, suggesting that the battle was viewed as an anomaly rather than as evidence of deeper problems with contemporary military doctrine. The failure to learn from Posada reflects a pattern common in military history, were institutions structured around particular capabilities and assumptions about proper warfare resist incorporating lessons that challenge their fundamental premises, preferring to explain away defeats that don't fit their models, rather than undertaking the difficult work of reconceptualizing their entire approach to conflict. The role of the common soldiers and peasants in the Wallachian victory introduces questions about social structures and military participation that medieval chroniclers largely ignored, focused as they were on the actions of nobles and kings, but which modern historians recognize as central to understanding how the battle unfolded and what it signified. The Wallachian forces included large numbers of men who owned little or no land, who had no formal military training, and who fought with weapons they made themselves or adapted from agricultural tools. Yet these supposedly inferior troops proved capable of defeating the military elite of one of Europe's major kingdoms when fighting under conditions that played to their strengths. Their victory suggests that the military dominance of the armoured cavalry class depended not on any inherent superiority, but on maintaining control over the terms of engagement, on ensuring that battles occurred in open terrain suitable for mounted charges, and on preventing opponents from using tactics or terrain that would neutralise the cavalry's advantages. When those conditions could not be maintained, as in the Posada Valley, the elaborate social and economic system that supported heavy cavalry and justified the nobility's privileged position on the basis of their supposedly unique military value proved far more fragile than its beneficiaries wanted to acknowledge. Basarab's ability to mobilise and effectively employ these lower status troops reveals something important about Wallachian society and political structures, suggesting patterns of authority and obligation different from those prevailing in more rigidly hierarchical kingdoms, though the limited sources make it difficult to reconstruct the specific mechanisms through which the voivode raised and commanded his forces. The aftermath of Posada reverberated through Charles Robert's remaining years, shaping his policies and constraining his options in ways that diminished his effectiveness as ruler, even as he worked to recover from the disaster. The king faced persistent criticism from factions within the Hungarian nobility, who questioned his judgment and used the defeat to challenge his authority on unrelated matters, creating political instability that he had to address through a combination of conciliation and force. The need to rebuild military capabilities drained resources that might otherwise have been invested in economic development or administrative improvements, keeping the kingdom focused on recovering from the disaster rather than advancing toward new objectives. Charles Robert never again attempted a major campaign against Wallachia, implicitly acknowledging that the costs and risks of such ventures exceeded any potential benefits, and subsequent Hungarian policy toward the region emphasized containment and occasional punitive raids, rather than the kind of comprehensive subjugation that had been attempted in 1330. The king died in 1342, having restored much of his kingdom's strength, and having ensured a relatively smooth succession to his son Louis. But the shadow of Posada hung over his final years, a reminder that even well-planned military operations could end in catastrophe when opponents refused to cooperate by fighting on terms favourable to the invader. Basarab's own fate following his great victory remains somewhat obscure, with sources providing conflicting information about when and how he died, though most modern historians believe he lived until approximately 1352, giving him more than 2 decades to consolidate the independence he had won, and to establish institutions that would allow Wallachia to survive as an autonomous principality. The voivode's later years apparently focused on internal development rather than external expansion, on building administrative structures that could function without constant personal intervention from the ruler, and on establishing relationships with neighbouring powers that recognised Wallachian independence while avoiding provocations that might trigger another invasion. He succeeded in passing power to his son Nicolae Alexandru, suggesting that he had created not just a personal dominion, but a lasting political entity with mechanisms for orderly succession, though the sources provide frustratingly little detail about how this was accomplished, or what challenges he faced in making the transition from military leader to state builder. The principality that emerged from Basarab's reign would continue to exist as an identifiable political entity for more than 4 centuries, maintaining a distinct identity despite repeated Ottoman, Hungarian and later Russian pressures, suggesting that the foundations laid in the early 14th century proved surprisingly durable. The Battle of Posada occupies an unusual position in historical memory, celebrated as a founding moment in Romanian national narratives, but relatively obscure in broader European histories that focus primarily on events in Western Europe and tend to treat the Carpathian region as peripheral to the main currents of medieval development. Romanian historians and chroniclers from later periods invested the battle with enormous significance, treating it as the moment when Romanian statehood truly began, when foreign domination was thrown off through military prowess and strategic brilliance, and when the distinctive character of Romanian political development first became clearly visible. These nationalist interpretations often projected backward onto Basarab and his contemporaries' concepts of national identity and ethnic consciousness that almost certainly did not exist in their 14th century forms, transforming a conflict over vassalage and territorial control into a proto-nationalist struggle for independence. But this retroactive mythologization does not negate the battle's genuine historical importance as a moment when power relationships in the region shifted dramatically. Western European sources, when they mention Posada at all, tend to treat it as a minor frontier skirmish, an unfortunate setback for the Hungarian king, but not an event significant enough to merit extended discussion, revealing the extent to which medieval historical consciousness centered on Western Europe and treated developments in the East as marginal unless they directly threatened core Western interests. The physical landscape where the battle occurred has changed considerably over the intervening 7 centuries, with modern development, changing land use patterns, and natural processes altering the terrain enough that attempts to precisely reconstruct the battle's geography face significant challenges. The valley that proved so deadly to the Hungarian army now carries roads and settlements that would have been unimaginable to 14th century observers, though certain topographical features remain essentially unchanged and allow researchers to understand why the location proved so advantageous to defenders and so catastrophic for the invaders. Archaeological work in the region has been limited, hampered by political conditions during much of the 20th century and by the difficulty of finding material remains from a battle fought primarily with weapons and equipment that organic processes would have long since destroyed, though occasional discoveries of armour fragments, weapons and human remains provide tantalising glimpses of the combat that unfolded there. The precise location of the battlefield remains subject to some debate, with different theories placing the main action in slightly different parts of the valley system, though all agree on the general area and on the basic topographical features that made the ambush possible. The military and political lessons of Posada extend beyond the specific circumstances of early 14th century Carpathian geopolitics to illuminate broader patterns in how power operates, how weaker forces can defeat stronger ones under the right conditions, and how strategic patience combined with tactical opportunism can achieve results that direct confrontation would make impossible. Basarab's campaign demonstrated the effectiveness of a strategy that later theorists would recognize as anticipating guerrilla warfare, avoiding battles on terms favorable to the enemy while creating conditions that gradually eroded his advantages, trading space for time while preserving one's own forces and waiting for the moment when terrain and circumstance would allow decisive action. The voivoda's understanding that the Hungarian army's logistical vulnerabilities represented its greatest weakness, that supply lines stretching through hostile territory could be severed, and that troops operating far from friendly bases would eventually exhaust their resources, showed strategic sophistication that many of his more celebrated contemporaries lacked. His willingness to endure criticism and uncertainty during the months when he refused to engage the Hungarians directly, maintaining a coherent strategy despite pressures to take action that would have been emotionally satisfying but strategically counterproductive, demonstrated the kind of discipline and long-term vision that distinguishes truly exceptional commanders from merely competent ones. The question of how medieval armies supplied themselves and maintained operational effectiveness over extended campaigns receives unusually clear illustration through the Hungarian experience in Wallachia, where the gradual attrition of resources and the difficulty of foraging in hostile territory, where the local population had hidden or destroyed supplies, slowly transformed a formidable military force into a vulnerable mass of hungry, exhausted men, increasingly desperate to reach safety. Medieval logistics operated on fundamentally different principles than modern military supply systems, relying on requisition from local populations rather than elaborate supply chains reaching back to centralized depots, depending on cavalry's ability to carry sufficient fodder for horses to reach the next grazing area, and assuming that armies would move quickly enough to outpace the devastation they created in the regions through which they passed. These assumptions broke down when enemies refused to allow quick decisions, when terrain limited the areas available for foraging, and when local populations actively resisted requisitions rather than passively accepting them as the cost of being in an army's path. The Hungarian army's deteriorating condition during its months in Wallachia reflects the consequences when these logistical assumptions proved invalid. As horses starved because the expected pastures had been burned, as foraging parties sent to collect supplies were ambushed before they could return, and as the cumulative effect of inadequate nutrition, poor sanitation, and constant stress gradually reduced combat effectiveness to the point where even the retreat became a military operation beyond the army's diminished capabilities. The psychological dimensions of the Posada campaign receive less attention in the sources than the tactical and operational details, but the psychological warfare that Basarab conducted through his strategy of evasion and harassment likely contributed as much to the final outcome as the actual combat in the valley. The Hungarian troops entered Wallachia expecting either a quick submission from Basarab or a conventional battle where their superior equipment and training would produce victory, but instead experienced months of frustration as their opponents remained visible but untouchable, as their presence in Wallachian territory produced no decisive results, and as the purpose of the campaign became increasingly unclear even to those conducting it. This psychological attrition wore down morale in ways that no single defeat could have done, creating a pervasive sense that the campaign had failed even before the disaster at Posada made that failure explicit and catastrophic. The constant small-scale attacks during the retreat, while militarily significant for the casualties they inflicted, may have been even more important for their psychological impact, preventing the Hungarians from ever feeling safe, denying them the sleep and rest that would have allowed recovery from the trauma of the initial ambush, and creating a sense of being hunted that must have been terrifying to men accustomed to viewing themselves as the hunters. The religious dimensions of the conflict complicate simple narratives about the battle's meaning, since both sides were Christian and could not employ the crusading ideology that often motivated and justified warfare between Christians and non-Christians, yet religious language and concepts pervaded medieval political thought in ways that made it impossible to understand such conflicts in purely secular terms. Charles Robert's claim to authority over Wallachia rested partly on theoretical frameworks derived from Christian political theology, which held that legitimate rule descended through hierarchies ordained by divine providence, and that vassals owed obedience to overlords as part of the divinely established order. Basarab's resistance could be framed as rebellion against this divinely sanctioned hierarchy, though it could equally be argued that he was defending his people's legitimate autonomy against unjust foreign domination, and that Hungarian claims to overlordship rested on military force, rather than any genuine religious or moral foundation. The chroniclers on both sides attempted to interpret the battle's outcome as evidence of divine judgment, with Hungarian sources treating it as punishment for unspecified sins that required penance and reform, while Romanian sources celebrated it as God's endorsement of Basarab's just cause. But these theological explanations probably mattered less to the actual participants than the immediate concerns of survival and victory. The involvement of the Orthodox Church in Wallachian society and the Catholic Church in Hungarian society added another layer of complexity, though the sources suggest that religious differences played a relatively minor role in the conflict compared to political and strategic considerations. The economic consequences of the campaign and battle extended far beyond the immediate costs of fielding the army and replacing the losses, affecting trade patterns, development trajectories, and resource allocation for years afterward, in ways that are difficult to quantify but certainly significant. The disruption of normal economic activity during the campaign, the destruction of crops and livestock in the war zone, and the death or displacement of agricultural workers created food shortages and price spikes that affected populations far removed from the actual fighting. The diversion of Hungarian resources toward military expenses meant that funds were unavailable for other purposes, postponing infrastructure projects, reducing the ability to respond to crop failures or natural disasters, and limiting investment in the kind of economic development that might have strengthened the kingdom's long-term prosperity. For Wallachia, the victory brought independence, but also required maintaining military capabilities sufficient to deter future Hungarian attempts at reconquest. Requiring resources that might otherwise have been invested in economic development, and creating a strategic culture that emphasized military readiness over other policy priorities. The battle's impact on regional trade networks remains difficult to trace through the limited sources, but the disruption of established patterns of Hungarian influence in Wallachia likely affected commerce, with some trade routes becoming less reliable, while others perhaps opened up as Basarab established relationships with different partners. The role of individual decisions and chance events in shaping the battle's outcome raises counterfactual questions about how different choices might have produced different results, though such speculation necessarily remains uncertain. Had Charles Robert decided to withdraw a few weeks earlier, before autumn weather deteriorated, the Hungarian army might have escaped without catastrophic losses, denying Basarab his crushing victory while leaving the larger strategic questions unresolved. Had the Hungarian commanders recognized the danger posed by the Posada Valley and selected an alternative route, or sent sufficient advance forces to secure the heights before committing the main army, the ambush might have failed or produced much more modest results. Had Basarab's forces revealed themselves prematurely, or had they lacked the discipline to maintain their positions during the long wait for the Hungarian column to fully commit to the valley, the tactical advantage might have evaporated and the battle's outcome reversed. These possibilities suggest that Posada was not inevitable, that the disaster that befell the Hungarians resulted from a specific combination of circumstances, decisions, and chance events rather than from some predetermined historical logic. Yet the strategic situation that created the context for the battle reflected deeper patterns that individual decisions could modify but not transform, suggesting limits to how different the outcome could realistically have been given the underlying power relationships and geographical constraints. The transmission of knowledge about Posada through subsequent generations reveals how historical memory operates selectively, emphasizing certain aspects while forgetting others, and how the same event can be understood in radically different ways depending on the purposes for which it is being remembered. Romanian historical consciousness preserved Posada as a foundational moment, ensuring that each generation learned about Basarab's victory and understood it as evidence of Romanian capability for independent political existence, while Hungarian historical memory largely suppressed or minimized the defeat, treating it as an unfortunate incident rather than a catastrophe worthy of extended reflection. The varying accounts in different medieval chronicles reflect these different purposes, with sources sympathetic to Hungarian perspectives, providing minimal detail and often attributing the defeat to factors beyond the king's control, while sources more favourable to Wallachian independence emphasise Basarab's strategic brilliance and the justice of his cause. Modern historical scholarship attempts to reconstruct what actually happened by comparing these biased sources and supplementing them with material evidence where available. But the fundamental problem remains that our understanding of the battle depends on sources created by people with particular agendas and perspectives, who are not attempting to provide the kind of objective, comprehensive account that modern historians would prefer, leaving many questions permanently unanswerable due to the absence of reliable evidence.